there comes a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when the soul no longer rushes to rescue others from the storms they have summoned. A moment when the empath, long bound by invisible threads of obligation and emotional sacrifice, lays down the weight of the world. This moment is not born of bitterness, but of awakening. To feel deeply is a gift, but it is also a silent, relentless burden that often goes unnoticed, even by the one who carries it. The empath moves through the world like a tuning fork, constantly vibrating in resonance with the emotional states of others. Joy, sorrow, fear, guilt, these are not merely observed in others but absorbed as if they were one's own. It's not a choice, it is a natural, unconscious response. In a room full of unspoken tension, the empath senses the heaviness before a word is said. In the smallest shift of tone or flicker of expression, they read stories that even the speaker is unaware of telling. This hypersensitivity to emotional undercurrents is often praised as compassion, and indeed it is. But it is also a life lived in a state of permanent alertness. Every interaction becomes a subtle negotiation between the empath's inner peace and the emotional state of the other. If someone is angry, the empath tries to calm them. If someone is wounded, they try to heal them. If someone is emotionally distant, they try to reach them. The empath is rarely allowed to simply exist. They are always responding, adjusting, absorbing. But what is the cost of this continuous tuning into others? What is sacrificed when your identity becomes a mirror for everyone else's storms? Over time, the empath begins to mistake responsiveness for love, and exhaustion for connection. They learn to value themselves by how useful they are to the emotional needs of others. Their worth becomes entangled in their ability to soothe pain, to fix chaos, to be the emotional glue holding others together. But all the while, they are leaking, quietly, invisibly. Their energy drains not from any dramatic event, but from the slow erosion of never the one who gets to fall apart, who gets to be held instead of always holding. They walk through life in a subtle state of depletion, so accustomed to emotional labor that they do not even recognize it as work. People begin to expect the empath's presence as a given. They become the one everyone turns to when things fall apart, the one who always understands, the one who never needs anything. In truth, the empath does need something, desperately, but they often don't know how to ask for it. And if they do, their needs are seen as surprising or inconvenient. They have trained others and themselves to believe they are endlessly available. There is no boundary because boundaries were never taught. Or if they were learned through guilt. Through the feeling that setting one meant hurting someone, disappointing someone, letting someone down. So the empath keeps tuning, keeps responding until the signal from their own soul grows faint, buried under the noise of everyone else's needs. Even in silence, the empath is rarely at rest. Their minds replay conversations, analyze what wasn't said, question whether they did enough. They carry invisible stories, the pain of others stored in their bones, the grief of others echoing in their dreams. And they call this empathy, not realizing that true empathy includes the self, but in their world they are last, always last. What they do not yet see is that this constant emotional tuning is not harmony, it is enslavement. It is the self being fractured into 1,000 frequencies, none of them their own. It is a life lived in echo, never in voice. The empath has become a vessel for everyone else's storm. But who holds them when the weight becomes unbearable? Who listens to them when their own soul begins to crack under the silence of unmet needs? The truth is, most people do not notice when the empath is drowning, because the empath has become an expert at smiling while sinking. They are praised for their strength when in reality, they are breaking quietly, heroically. Alone the empaths early in life that survival is tied to harmony. That love is earned through emotional attunement, and that safety lies in being agreeable, pleasant and needed. So they construct a mask, not out of deceit, but out of necessity. This mask becomes their persona, the socially acceptable version of themselves crafted to meet the expectations of others. It is a version that listens without interrupting, comforts without complaint, supports without needing support in return. Over time this persona becomes so refined, so reliable that even the empath forgets where the mask ends and the true self begins. They walk through the world as caretakers, as emotional stabilizers, often admired for their grace, but rarely truly seen for who they are beneath the surface. The danger in this performance is not only that others believe it, but that the empath does too. They begin to believe that their value lies only in their usefulness, in their ability to maintain peace, in their talent for emotional camouflage. But beneath the carefully constructed exterior is a mirror that reflects the emotional landscapes of everyone else. Partners, friends, co-workers, family members. The empath becomes skilled at showing people what they want to see, adapting themselves to the emotional rhythms of whoever stands in front of them. They reflect joy to the joyful, calm to the anxious, strength to the weak. They shape shift, not to deceive, but because it feels natural, because it feels safe, because it keeps the peace. And yet, in doing so they lose their own reflection. They look in the mirror and see the pieces of everyone else, but they cannot find themselves. The mask smiles, reassures, agrees, while the soul behind it quietly fades. There is a haunting emptiness that begins to grow in this gap between persona and self. A quiet ache. A question whispered in the moments between helping others. Who am I when no one needs me? The empath has spent so much time maintaining connection through emotional performance that they begin to fear their own stillness. They fear what might surface in the silence if they were no longer anchored to the needs of others. The very idea of choosing themselves feels dangerous, almost selfish, because their entire identity has been constructed around relational worth. The mask tells them that love is conditional, that being authentic is too much, too inconvenient, too messy for others to accept, so they keep wearing it, even when it starts to suffocate. They keep mirroring others even when they feel hollow inside. They keep showing up, even when every part of them wants to disappear. They do it because it's what they've always done. Because it feels like love. Because they've been taught, through subtle cues or direct trauma, that peace is not a right but a reward for compliance. But slowly beneath the surface, something begins to stir. The true self, long buried beneath layers of social expectation and emotional labor, begins to rise. It doesn't roar, not at first, it whispers. It questions. It wonders what life might be like if they didn't to manage everyone's emotions. It wonders who they might be if they stopped performing and simply existed, and in that wondering, a tension emerges, a sacred tension between who they are and who've been pretending to be. This is not rebellion. It is the beginning of reclamation. It is the soft, undeniable pull of the self saying there is more to you than being needed. There is more to you than being liked. There is more to you than being the mirror in someone else's house. You are allowed to have a face of your own. You are allowed to remove the mask. You are allowed to stop performing peace and begin to experience it from within. But first, you must stand still long enough to remember what your own reflection looks like. Fear is a quiet kind of suffering that comes from always being the strong one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs the chaos and offers calm in return. The empath, so deeply attuned to the needs and emotions of others, often forgets or denies the presence of their own unmet needs. They push aside fatigue in the name of being available, suppress frustration for the sake of keeping the peace, and swallow anger to avoid making anyone else uncomfortable. They convince themselves that to feel deeply is a strength, and it is, but that strength becomes a cage when it comes without balance. In their effort to be everything for everyone, they begin to abandon parts of themselves. The sorrow they never speak of, the rage they never express, the weariness they never admit, all of it forms a hidden reservoir, a shadow silently growing beneath the surface. The shadow, the part of the psyche where all the repressed emotions and dissound truths are stored, is not a monster, but a messenger. It holds the parts of the empath that were too much, too emotional, too selfish, too needy. It carries the voice that was silenced, the needs that were minimized, the boundaries that were ignored. And as the empath continues to give without receiving, to listen without being heard, to carry what was never theirs to carry, the shadow grows heavier. It begins to leak out in subtle ways, in moments of unexplained anxiety, in waves of exhaustion that no amount of rest can fix, in quiet resentments that rise like ghosts in the night. The empath may not even recognize these feelings as their own. So practiced are they in suppressing what doesn't serve others, but the body knows. The soul knows. And there comes a point when the inner self can no longer be silenced. What once felt like love begins to feel like depletion. What once looked like kindness begins to feel like erasure. And the empath starts to sense that something is wrong. Not with the people around them, but with the way they have been relating to themselves. They start to see that their compassion has come at a cost, that their emotional labor has become a form of self-neglect. And this realization does not arrive gently, it comes with grief, with guilt, with the painful clarity that they have participated in their own depletion by constantly placing others before themselves. This is not about blame. It is about awakening. The empath begins to understand that true compassion must include the self, that being endlessly available is not sustainable, that boundaries are not barriers to love but expressions of it. And in this new awareness, a quiet rebellion begins. The empath starts to pull their energy back. Not out of cruelty, not out of coldness, but out of necessity. They begin to say no even when it makes others uncomfortable. They begin to speak truths they once swallowed. They begin to honor their anger, not as something to be feared, but as a sacred signal that something has been out of alignment. In choosing to acknowledge the shadow, they do not become hard or unkind. They become whole. They learn that it is not their job to carry what others refuse to hold. They realize that healing does not mean breaking themselves open for others to take what they need. Healing means reclaiming the parts of themselves they abandoned in the name of being good. And in this reclamation, a new kind of empathy is born, one rooted not in martyrdom but in mutuality. One that says, I can care for you, but I will no longer abandon myself to do it. I can feel your pain, but I will not wear it as my own. I can walk with you, but not if it means leaving myself behind. The shadow becomes integrated, no longer a threat, but a guide, and in its light, the empath begins to redefine what love really means. There is a point in the empath's journey when something fundamental begins to shift, something subtle but undeniable, something that marks the beginning of a return to the self. After years, sometimes decades, of putting others first, of being the caretaker, the healer, the one who understands without needing to be understood, a question begins to rise to the surface, slow and quiet at first, then louder, heavier, harder to ignore. The question is simple but profound: what if I no longer made my life about everyone else's needs? This question doesn't come from bitterness or resentment. It comes from exhaustion, from the soul's deep yearning to finally be seen and heard not by others, but by oneself. This is the beginning of a transformation not outwardly dramatic but inwardly revolutionary, a shift from self-erasure to self-recognition, from performance to presence, from fragmentation to wholeness. Up until now, the empath has shaped their identity through the eyes of others, defining themselves by their ability to anticipate pain, to prevent conflict, to offer comfort in every situation. Their emotional intuition has been a form of currency in relationships, an unspoken agreement that says, I will keep you safe from yourself if you love me for it. But beneath that agreement lies a dangerous illusion, that their value is conditional, that their place in others' lives is earned only through self-sacrifice. And when that illusion begins to break, when the empath sees that their love has become a form of survival, they begin to long for something deeper than being needed. They begin to long for peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from keeping everyone else happy, but the lasting peace that comes from being rooted in truth. The path toward that kind of peace is not paved with external approval. It is carved inward, through the painful and liberating process of individuation. This is not a rejection of others but a reunion with the self. It is the empath turning inward to ask, who am I apart from their stories, their wounds, their demands, their fears? Who am I when I am not managing everyone else's emotions? And in asking these questions, they begin to see how much of their life has been lived in reaction to the feelings and expectations of others. They see how their sense of self has been diluted by years of absorbing what was never theirs to hold, and they begin to imagine a life lived not in response, but in alignment. This alignment does not happen all at once. It comes in moments, small but sacred choices that begin to reshape the foundation of their life. The choice to pause before saying yes. The choice to walk away instead of in someone else's chaos. The choice to speak a truth, even when their voice shakes. These moments are not easy. They are uncomfortable. They disrupt the old patterns. They challenge the persona that says, be agreeable, be quiet, be needed. But each time the empath chooses authenticity over approval, they strengthen a deeper sense of identity, one not built on sacrifice, but on sovereignty. Individuation is not about becoming selfish, it is about becoming whole. It is the slow integration of all the pieces of the self that were abandoned in the name of belonging. The empath begins to understand that they are allowed to exist outside of someone else's crisis. That their life has meaning even when they are not fixing someone else's pain. They begin to notice the small things again. The sound of their own breath, the quiet of their thoughts, the stillness that used to feel empty but now feels sacred. They begin to trust that they can be loved without earning it. That their presence is enough. Even when they are not emotionally laboring to maintain connection. And in that trust, something profound awakens within them, something that whispers of freedom, of peace, of a home within themselves they had forgotten. Was ever there is a silence that arrives when the empath finally begins to withdraw their energy from the places it was once scattered. A silence not filled with noise or expectation but with space, with breath, with an unfamiliar stillness that at first feels like loneliness but slowly reveals itself as clarity. In the absence of constant emotional negotiation, when the empath stops adjusting their tone, their posture, their truth for the comfort of others, the world seems quieter. Not because there is less happening, but because they are no longer absorbing every that isn't theirs. The calls that once came daily, the constant messages from people needing support, validation, advice, they slow down, and eventually some stop altogether. The empath, who for so long was the emotional center of everyone else's lives, begins to remain when they are no longer offering themselves as a sanctuary. And this realization can be painful, because it shows what was built on genuine connection and what was built on convenience. In this sacred silence, there is a grieving. Not just for the relationships that fall away, but for the self that was shaped in their service. The empath begins to feel the weight of all the moments they ignored their own pain to tend to someone else's. The weight of all the times they silenced their truth to avoid disrupting another's comfort. The weight of all the years they spent performing safety for others while never truly feeling safe themselves. This grief is not weakness. It is a rite of passage. An initiation into a new kind of existence where peace is not earned through sacrifice but reclaimed through presence. And as the empath allows the silence to hold them, without rushing to fill it, they begin to hear something they hadn't heard in a long time. Their own voice at first. That voice is quiet, cautious, unfamiliar. It has been buried beneath years of noise. Other people's needs, expectations, dramas, emotions. But in the stillness it begins to return, not with fanfare but with certainty. It speaks in simple truths, not grand declarations. It says, I am tired, I need rest, I want something different, I deserve to be held. These words feel both foreign and ancient. As if they have always been there, waiting for permission to rise. And the empath, for perhaps the first time, begins to believe them. They begin to realize that their own needs are not interruptions. That their own boundaries are not punishments, that their own desires are not indulgences. They begin to see that peace was never about fixing others. It was about remembering themselves. This kind of peace is not loud or visible. It is not the peace of perfect relationships or controlled outcomes. It is the peace of no longer betraying the self for acceptance. It is the quiet strength that comes from knowing you no longer have to explain, justify or earn your existence. It is the rootedness that emerges when you stop outsourcing your sense of worth to how well you manage other people's emotions. And with each breath, each moment of choosing self-trust over self-abandonment, the empath becomes less of a mirror and more of a presence, no longer shaped by the emotional weather around them, but anchored in their own inner climate. There is no grand conclusion to this transformation, no final arrival. It is a continual unfolding, a deepening, a remembering. The empath does not become cold or distant, they become discerning. They do not love less, they love cleaner. They no longer give as a means of survival, but as an act of truth. And those who can meet them there, in that truth stay, not because they are being rescued, but because they recognize something sacred in someone who has learned to love without losing themselves. In this peace the empath finally finds not the end of connection, but the beginning of one that includes them fully, honestly, entirely, without distortion, without performance, without the silent erosion of the self that once passed for love. To choose peace over people is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of maturity. It is the empath's quiet revolution. A refusal to betray oneself in the name of emotional labor. And in this choice the empath does not become less loving. They become more whole. Because peace, when chosen consciously, becomes the most radical form of love. Love that finally includes the self. Thank you.